So just starting on the So a little bit on, so why did we start doing this inquiry? It came out of the work that we've done as a secretariat of the all-party parliamentary group on street children, and engaging in conversations with Sarah, who I'll introduce properly later, on where did we want to take that group, and what was a topic that we could really get a substantive engagement on. And for those of you who work with children who are street connected, it's a world that's bounded away by two bookends. You've got violence on the one hand and economic disadvantage on the other hand. And we were involved in a really exciting project that was around child labour. We thought that is a really important topic for us to engage in and to really try to take stock, look at where we are, and particularly in the context of a sense that there being a feeling from a lot of people we talked to that child labour had been done, as it were, like, oh, that's a problem that's been sorted out, settled, we don't need to go back to that. And actually what we were seeing was the opposite, that numbers have stalled and in many places are going up. And it is such a critical issue for our sector. So children on the street are disproportionately affected in terms of worst forms of child labour. And many of the challenges regarding how to respond to children on the street who are in the worst forms of child labour bring into stark relief many of the challenges across the whole sector, and how more generally do we respond globally as a global community to children in the worst forms of child labour. And I think particularly issues such as when to respect a child's agency and choice and to encourage that, and when to make decisions about protection, which are very difficult issues sometimes in the sector and are really brought out by children who've often elected to be on the street or to leave their families. But also that better understanding the causes and consequences of a child being engaged in the worst forms of child labour is really enhances our understanding of children on the street and why they've done it, as well as really trying to understand why some interventions don't work and why poorly designed interventions sometimes have the opposite effect that you would expect. And our strong sense was that by doing an inquiry which was really bringing children's perspectives into that would bring additional thought and clarity to responding to it for British parliamentarians. So I mentioned that progress is stalling. Aggregate numbers are going up globally, according to the ILO and UNICEF. But I think, fascinatingly or worryingly, we are also seeing a rolling back on protections for children in the worst forms of child labour, even in countries like the US, where we've seen very recently a rollback on legislation. And I think that's a really worrying development. And perhaps not unexpected with the twin pressures of COVID. We've got the impacts on the economy, but also demographics in some countries. And then I think the third reason why it felt so important to have this discussion was that in spite, at the surface, there's an enormous sense of international consensus on this issue. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most ratified human rights convention in the world, and we know that the relevant ILO conventions are also, highly signed up to by member states. But actually, underneath that apparent consensus, there's some very real differences about what are appropriate and, importantly, effective responses. And in particular, how do we involve children themselves in defining what decent work is in their context, and what might be responses to the challenges of children being in the worst forms of child labour. We wanted, as part of this, as I mentioned, we did the project that we're involved with on Clarissa is very, very, very grounded in listening to children. And we made sure that this inquiry was also grounded on listening to children. But just to introduce Sarah, I'm doing the panel one by one because it's always hard when you get everybody all in one go. Sarah is the wonderful chair of your parliamentary group on street children. She's also the chair of the International Development Committee, which is why we were so excited when she took on this role. MP for Rotherham. And I think the reason why we've enjoyed working with Sarah so much is around her deep commitment to child rights, but also to listening to children's perspective, particularly children who are marginalised economically and socially. And so it's been brilliant having her as part of this. And she's going to share with us a little bit of her experience of being part of the inquiry and her takeaways and some of the key recommendations.
Thank you. Do you want microphone or not microphone? Yes.
Sorry, I didn't
microphone. Is that?
There you go. Yeah.
Thank you all for being here. I want to start by apologising on behalf of my colleagues because we're actually on a one-line week today and tomorrow. That means everybody can actually be in their constituencies rather than in this place. But we did have a lot of both MP and peers engaging throughout the process, and my job is to feed back to them on this. I don't chair APPGs anymore, but I couldn't not chair this one. It brings together everything that I really, really care about. Child protection, the rights and the voice of children being at the centre of the decisions about them, and looking at a world where more and more are in poverty, more and more driven by the greed of people largely in the Northern Hemisphere. So to bring all of that together with one inquiry that looks specifically at children involved with small independent businesses and how we as a country, the government and internationally can work together to make sure that they have a better future was something that I literally couldn't resist. It was important for us to have the voices of the children right at the centre of our inquiry, and so we worked directly with two groups of children from Bangladesh and Nepal so that their thoughts framed everything that we did, and then it was our job to go out and find the evidence to back up what they were saying. We also involved the not-for-profit sector, the ILO, the International Labour Organisation, corporations like Marshalls, small businesses, the UN Global Compact, and the Kathmandu Business Association. I was really fortunate to meet some of the FCDO team working on this up in East Kilbride, and I'm really grateful that Andrew and Seamus engaged so fully in this inquiry. The work that they do is crucial, and anything we can do to amplify that, we're really, really keen to help with. Most crucially, the children that we heard from worked with the Clarissa programme, and we're going to hear from Danny, I think after me. I was also fortunate, I've got two colleagues from the International Development Select Committee here, Danny and Emma, and the committee went out to Nepal and met some of the Clarissa children. And that was really important for me. First of all, they wanted to grill us on what we were doing, why, and how it was going to impact them, but also just hearing from them. I mean, he is much better on the language than I am. So the APPG is street children. This is about street-connected children. We're talking about the worst kinds of child labour. Myself, I was washing up at 12 in the local pub, and I thought it was the best thing ever. And the children were very clear to us that for some of them, this is what they want to do. They do feel empowered. They do feel proud to bring some resources back to their family. So hearing that, hearing about the unintended consequences were really, really important. And Danny and I were talking just before we started. If you ask people who are in the situation you're trying to support what the problem is, what the solution is, and then give them responsibility to deliver it, it's always more effective. It always is. And we joke, but I kind of think this might be a policy that I'm going to push. Maybe if we call the people that we're trying to support consultants, give them the money, that's how to get them the power, the voice, and the respect that they actually deserve. It's a driver for me, and I think you'll find when you read this report, it's something that we all pretty much signed up to. I'm going to rattle through the recommendations. I know that all of you will want to read this in full, but just in case you don't have time, let me do it as sort of a framing exercise. So the recommendations recognise that the UK government has a significant role to play in tackling child labour through UK aid as well as through domestic regulations, diplomatic and trade channels. Domestic regulation is only one very necessary link in the effort to tackle child labour. When it operates alone, it can push children into more hazardous forms of work if UK-based companies refuse to work with the suppliers who present the risk of child labour entering the supply chain. And the supply chain is the key phrase that I want you all to focus on. That's what we need to be thinking. Not the first tier, but the second and the subsidiary. That's where we need to be focusing our attention. Therefore, in addition to regulation, there is a need to fund dyslexic Andalusism isn't helping, is it? Participatory programming in country to address the causes of child labour. Considered in this context, this report's recommendations operate in a pincer movement to strengthen the UK's efforts to tackle child labour at home and abroad. At home, the report recommends that regulations around modern slavery are tightened to ensure that child labour is specifically addressed in the company's modern slavery statements. We found that currently child labour is subsumed within the wider definitions of modern slavery, under which not all forms of child labour may be deemed to be modern slavery, and so many are falling through cracks because of that. The report also demands that the government give teeth to the current regulations by making a failure to report a disqualification offence under the Companies Directors Disqualification Act. By introducing a new offence under the Modern Slavery Act, that of supplying false information in relation to modern slavery statements, if the person or company either knows or is reckless as to whether it is false or incomplete. Abroad, the recommendations that the FCDO continues to fund participatory approaches to tackle child labour, with a focus on informal economies where the majority of child labour actually occurs. One clear message from the evidence received during the inquiry was that in order to tackle child labour, the involvement of children at all stages of programming, so that's designing, implementation and evaluation, was necessary to ensure the measures were appropriate and not overly heavy-handed. Taking actions such as the immediate closure of all businesses found to have child labour can actually push children into more hazardous forms of work. We also need to ensure that the drivers of child labour, in particular contexts, are thoroughly understood, and the children are absolutely the best people to advise us on that. As Chair of the International Development Committee, I know how vital it is for programmes like Clarissa to be funded and resourced, as we've seen the immense difference firsthand that it makes to these children's lives. Children have a strong voice. We need to ensure that they are asked, that they are listened to, and that we champion them. And that is the goal of this report and this event today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We're now going to just switch perspective, and I'm delighted to introduce Bea Delgado, who was a very active contributor to the inquiry, has been brilliantly engaged. She has been with Global Compact for 8 years. We were just chatting outside the meeting room about her recent trip to DRC. She's got incredible experience of the sector and trying to think about child labour from the perspective of businesses, and has a real commitment to supporting businesses pragmatically, practically in how they improve their human rights footprint. So Bea, over to you.
Thank you, Leah. Hi everybody, thanks for having me today. If I can just begin by perhaps giving some context to how we became involved in the inquiry, and also the perspective of UN Global Compact Network UK. For those of you that aren't aware, we are one of the world's largest corporate social responsibility initiatives. Our organisation is founded on 4 pillars. They are human rights, labour rights, anti-corruption and the environment. So by definition, it's part of our mission to engage on labour rights, of which of course child labour falls under. Prior to engaging in this inquiry, we were involved with within a consortium of different organisations on a child labour project looking at the worst forms of child labour in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Ethiopia. And that project looked at testing innovative approaches to alleviate the worst forms of child labour and reduce it. And so I think echoing some of Sarah's previous comments in terms of some of the nuances around child labour, they aren't well known nor documented, and this kind of information really is vital to the work that we do with the private sector, because if we're asking businesses to engage and invest on really critical issues within their value chains and supply chains, it's an unfair ask if they're not informed on what's actually happening on the ground. And we have to remember that global supply chains are extremely complex, and that businesses don't all have direct link to what's happening on the ground. And so it could be a web that, past tier one of the supply chain becomes very, very difficult to understand. And so it's vital that organisations like ours, as well as Danny and the project, in fact, Danny and Clarissa and the project were working simultaneously actually at the same time that the project I just mentioned, PACE, which was Partnership Against Child Exploitation. And so there were many lessons learned from Clarissa that we were taking on board and trying to kind of ensure that we took those lessons for value and kind of brought that out in the work that we were doing on the ground. I'm currently, as Peter mentioned, working on a child labour project, but it's more broadly looking also at modern slavery back in the Congo, looking specifically in Eastern DRC. And for those of you working on the environment or just transition will know this is a very, very important time now, I think, for government and also for the private sector to come together, listen to folks like us that have been on the ground and understand what those challenges are, what street children are actually facing, what the drivers are, but also not just understand those challenges, but actually demonstrate tangible actions towards them. And that's something that I know the business community in the UK is extremely supportive of, and we've seen that very recently. A couple of weeks ago there was an event in Parliament looking at mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And that's something that the business community not only supports, but is really pushing to be mandated so that it levels the playing field. And I'll speak about that in a bit more detail in a few moments. In terms of the report itself, we are extremely supportive of the recommendations. There's a few I'd like to kind of just pull out, which are very specific to the private sector. So, essentially, this report is calling for an update to the modern slavery strategy to enhance transparency in supply chains. And what we do know is that, similar to what Sarah was mentioning, that we know it's important to listen to the voices of those children before any kind of regulatory framework or legislation addresses the issues of child labour. Now, similarly, when we're talking to business, it's not just talking to them and explaining to them this is what we'd like you to do, but it's also working with them. They need to be part of the conversations, and that ensures that we can make it the possibility to strike that balance between safeguarding children's rights, but also promoting more responsible business practices. Recommendation 4 specifically looks at amending Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, and this looks at a specific reference to child labour. That's extremely important from a private sector perspective. If it's all-encompassing at the moment under the umbrella term of modern slavery, it makes it really difficult to understand exactly what businesses are doing to address this problem. And pulling that out in its entirety allows us to understand what do those practical actions look like, and allows us as different stakeholders to hold those companies to account when they report on the actions that they take against child labour, if there is a specific reference to it in the Act. So that's a recommendation we're extremely supportive of. Recommendation 5 also calls for clearer penalties in terms of disqualifying directors and penalising false reporting. Now, initially, you may think that the business community may be less supportive of these measures, but as I was just talking earlier, actually what we're seeing is that businesses are desperate for a level playing field. At the moment, that's not happening. You have many, many companies that are effectively addressing issues such as child labour, but it comes at an unfair disadvantage. And so we need to level that playing field, and one way of doing that is through legislation and ensuring that everybody has an equal opportunity to make the right investment and to allocate the necessary resources in order to tackle child labour and global supply chains. And then looking at recommendation 10, it is also something that we know, talking to many businesses in our network, is something that we support, and we know that they are very, very supportive of as well. It's penalties may be necessary to ensure accountability, so it may appear less favourable initially, but as I said, it's something that we have been speaking to businesses about in the UK, but also abroad. And I'd like to just wrap up, my final comment is in terms of that on-the-ground experience. I was just talking to someone before the session today, saying that I've lost count as to how many times I've actually been to the Congo now. And every time I go, I learn something new about what's happening on the ground. And what I take away from that is that we're constantly learning about these problems and these dilemmas. They are multi-dimensional, very, very complex, and the nuances specifically for me is something that makes these trips, as hazardous as they may be, and extremely challenging, definitely worthwhile. And I feel like I have a responsibility to come back and report on the findings of the conditions of these street children in forums like this one, so that those of us working on legislation and regulation really understand the different elements involved and kind of how we can address these challenges in a meaningful way. Because we've been talking about this problem for decades, and the needle hasn't moved as fast as necessary, so something has to change. And in terms of the just transition, you know, for those of you who are aware, in terms of minerals and coming from Eastern Congo specifically, that's something that by default our government and actually, you know, the G7, G8 governments' ambition of a cleaner, greener economy is going to push that demand for these minerals higher, and that will result in even more children being caught up in child labour. So it's a very, very timely discussion, conversation. It's one that's extremely critical to the just transition, and without the voices of these children at the forefront, it's not going to be just. Thank you.
Thanks, Bea. And last, definitely not least, Danny Burns, who is a professor at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. I hadn't realised he's actually based in Edinburgh, so he does an amazing commute. Danny is going to also share some of his reflections on the inquiry, but particularly focusing on what's been touched on by all of us, I guess. What is it about involving children, and how do you involve children to really enrich your research? Danny?
Thanks, Kate, and thanks everyone. I think I wanted to start off with the children and to say, whenever you meet any of the children that we're engaged with, you realise that every single day they face more risk, they take more decisions, they make more judgments, they analyse in a more comprehensive way than most of us will do in our lifetimes. And yet we stand at a distance and say we know what's best for them. And I think that's the starting point, is that we don't usually know what's best for them. They usually know what's best for themselves. And when they're together and can interrogate each other collectively, they have a very, very powerful analysis to bring to all of the debates. Clarissa is a large program. I could spend all day talking about it. We've been running for about 5 years. We work in urban areas, in Nepal, in the adult entertainment sector, in Bangladesh, in the leather sector. We're using a lot of mixed methods, qualitative research, but deeply participatory research, from GIS mapping to participatory video to a huge program of 13 action research groups in each country looking at critical issues, all the issues that they've identified. It's also been rooted in 400 life stories of children in each country. So those children in each of these sectors, they tell their stories to each other, those transcripts are collected. The children analyze the data. The children understand the causalities and explain that to each other. They can test it amongst each other. They think about what it is that they want to work on. That database, if you want to call it that, of 400 children telling their stories is huge in terms of the detail, the micro-level detail. And it's informed the program. So I'll build on that. I want to say a few things. The first thing echoes some of the things that Sarah talked about. What we know is that almost all of the children in the urban worst forms of child labour are in the informal sector. That's businesses that aren't registered, that don't technically exist. They're small businesses of maybe 2, 3, 4, 10, 15 people. And interestingly, and this is what the bit that we were perhaps most surprised by, although we shouldn't have been, most of these are playing to domestic markets. So both in the adult entertainment sector, yeah, there is a lot going on in Tamil and Kalamazoo, but also around the bus parks and all of the other areas in Gongaboo, the vast majority of the children are actually servicing, if that's the right word, domestic markets. And the same in Bangladesh for the leather sector. So it raises really difficult questions about, we talked about global supply chains. How do we get to the supply chains when we haven't got the levers that we often have with international products? It's a very different story. And just to give another bit of context there, we talk a lot about enforcement. In the countries like Bangladesh, you've got like 1 inspector to 10,000 businesses. Enforcement doesn't work. The policies are there, the enforcement's there in theory, but not in practice. So how are we actually going to get the change that needs to be made? The researchers surfaced some quite interesting things, challenges to some of our basic assumptions. Like, for example, we assume when we talk like I have just talked, that these small businesses are the perpetrators, if you like. But actually, very often, they're just one step up the ladder from the children that they once were. That 4 or 5 years ago, they were the children working in a small business, and they've managed to scrape enough money together to make themselves a business, and actually now they want to help other children. And now that's an assumption that just wasn't there. So we've been starting to work with small businesses in action research groups to create some of the change also. I'm going to give you a few little flavours of some of what some of this looks like. So one of the methods we've been using is GIS tracking on some of the neighbourhoods where the children are working and where they go every day. So we've had some of our teams accompany a child as they wake up in the morning, and they go through their day, and then they go to work, and then they come back again. Just a journey to work and my journey home, right? Because it's not safe. And then you start to think, well, actually, these kids are working 12 to 14 to 16 hours. But actually, when you track their day, particularly the girls are often working 2 or 3 hours at home as well. And they're frightened on their journeys. So you think about what does that mean across 17 hours. And then you begin to get some real insight into what their lives are like. That then gives them the basis to think about what do we want to work on. And they want that particular group wants to work on safety on the way to work and safety on the way home. And so they start to work in an action research group. And as I say, we've got 13 in each country looking at different issues, and that's just one of them. Just to give you a few insights into some of the other action research groups. In Bangladesh, we have a group of children who've been forced from economic circumstances, as most of these children are, sometimes also through family violence and other issues. They've been forced into this sort of work. And as a result, of course, they've left school. And sometimes they've been pushed out of school by COVID and other things more recently. Right? That doesn't mean they don't want to go to school. It does mean they can't go to school. So these children have said, we want to go to school, but we still have to work. But how are we going to do that? That's their inquiry question. That's what they're working with. And they've spent some time thinking about what they wanted to do. So they got together as a group, and they, as a group, have gone to the school, one of the schools, and they've talked to the teachers, and they've talked to the powers that be within the school. And they said, we want to come to the school like 1 day a week, or 2 days a week, or 3 hours a day, or whatever it is. We want to come part-time. That's not a concept that exists in the school system. And the school said, okay, we'll work with you to do that. And that's opening up a new pathway that simply wasn't there, because the children had the idea that they could work part-time. And now the school's looking at how they can share books, they're looking at bursaries for children, and then they've said, but we can only take 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 children. We need to speak to the other schools. So now the school is talking to all of the neighbouring schools to see if they can start to open up this process. This is the sort of action that children can take and initiate. And it can be really, really far-reaching. To give you another example, from the other end of the spectrum, where we're working with small businesses, some of the small businesses in Nepal have come together as consortiums and said, we don't want children in our businesses, we're going to clean up the area, and we are going to be the enforcers. So they're not relying on government inspectors anymore, they're creating an association which is going to do the enforcement across their neighbourhood. And now they're quite powerful people in their area. They have influence, they have networks, they can speak to other people. So when you're starting to think about what is the force of change, it's these small businesses of people who were child labourers 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And that gives you a model. Because where we were stuck was to say, you know, if there are 10,000 small businesses, where do you start? But actually you start by bringing them together, and then they create associations, and then they network to another association, and then they network to someone else, and they do the enforcement, and then it changes attitudes and so on. And that's real, that's realistic, that creates a change that's possible. So I think I just wanted to leave you with that, but also just to leave you with one other thought, which is this. Thinking about the leather sector for a minute, one of the things that we did in our early part of our research was establish that there were over 100 processes in the supply chain. Right? Not all of them, every bag or every leather pair of trousers or whatever it is has 100 processes, but let's say each one has 60. Let's say a pair of shoes has 60 processes. And a Bangladeshi person in a Bangladeshi market is paying £10 for those shoes. Now that's probably an expensive pair of shoes. Right, so let's say it's a bit less than that. And you know that at the top of the supply chain, they're going to take the biggest cut, the biggest margin for the people at the top, right? So maybe 2 or 3 are taking half of that. So you maybe got like £3 or £4 for the other 56 processes. Every one of those 56 processes has to make a profit out of that £3 or £4, out of that pair of shoes. How are they going to do it? By employing children. It's the only way they can survive. So you have to change the model. You have to change the economic model. Otherwise, this process will go over and over and over again. It's really stark when we look at it. So, in a sense, what that brings us to is children's voice. Yes, they can provide solutions, but also there has to be economic solutions. Social protection is an important part of it, but changing the business model itself is a crucial part of it. And the children also have a lot to say about that. So I'm sorry that's just such a tiny flavour of such a huge, exciting, interesting programme. But the message is the children provide the solutions. And all we have to do is support them.
Thank you, Danny. We've got a little bit of time for, how are we doing with your videos? Can we do them? Should we do questions and answers, and we'll set up the videos while we do it? Has anybody got a question for any of our panellists? I can speak some questions. Some 3 very different perspectives.
We also had a number of people that took part in the groups, and if they want to
Yes.
share their experiences.
Very good point, Sarah. So if there's anyone who took part in the inquiry who wants to either bring content to the inquiry or listen to the inquiry and want to share observations or additional thoughts, please feel free. we'd have another just loud voice. I think we're going to
Wow.
Hello everyone, I'm Medina and I run a small non-profit called Specific Children.
We'll get a mic to you.
So we work a lot with street connected children in Pakistan, and many of whom sort of juggle between going to non-formal schools and their other responsibilities and their other responsibilities. And I was just skimming through the recommendations, and the multi-sectoral approach bit stood out, and what Annie just talked to me just said also, and it really resonated. But I was just wondering how that piece comes into the recommendations. I think there's a lot of emphasis on the economic bit, which is extremely important, and it is one of the drivers of child labour. And a lot of the time when people ask children why they're not in school, they neglect to understand what drove them to other choices and how difficult it is to choose between work and school. But I was just wondering how much that comes into the recommendations, the need for providing those alternatives that can help them potentially envision or craft a different future. And it is really hard to stay through school. So acknowledging that.
Yeah, I think these are really difficult questions in a way, and we've been grappling with this when we talk to the children, because a lot of NGOs, for example, have education and provision of education as being one of the solutions, and yet we know that the children can't get to it, and it isn't a meaningful alternative for those children. And there is one of our groups which is specifically constructed around the problem that they identified, which was that they had training from NGOs and it still didn't make any difference. And that they now want to think about, well, what do we do if we had training from NGOs and it still didn't make any difference? So the answer, I think, is yes to support the vision, but to support their vision. And I think there is a real big difference in a sense between, an international community which has a vision for children and the vision of those children rooted in their real life experience. And I think that's the solution to that is to radically open up participatory processes which engage children. I think as soon as we do that, we will see those visions really, really clearly. And then, in a sense, it seems to me that the NGOs and the government agencies and the bilateral donors and so on can respond to that rather than setting an agenda which may or may not be relevant to the children. That's how I would approach it.
Some of the children in Nepal gave a very pretty clear example of this. An NGO was offering courses for seamstress and hairdressers, and that was it, choose one or the other. And one of the girls said, but I want to be a beautician. and so there was nothing for me. And it's that, and we find it again and again in our inquiries, it's that well-intended arrogance of people telling you what you can and can't have. Have this, you can have that, and if not, you step away. But I also want to say, schools in this country are making choices based on targets. A piece of casework, a little girl, she's 6 years old, she's got very aggressive cataracts, and I got involved, she was actually excluded because she was taking so many hospital appointments that the school were going to kick her out. So this is something which is happening around the world. I don't want this to be seen as a specific country issue. It's all of us. We don't ask, we make assumptions. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks. Vicky Johnson, University of the Highlands and Islands. Obviously, I totally welcome this research and this report. Fantastic. Confirms a lot of things that many, many NGOs and practitioners and researchers have been saying. But what do we do, Sarah B, about the resourcing of research, further research? When international government aid is going down, the GCIF funding for research with small third sector parties is being cut. You know, how do we get this message more broadly? And in terms of addressing inequality more broadly, and we should be doing that across the Sustainable Development Goals, across just transitions. But actually, you know, we need more research, we need more interventions which are resourced both by business, by philanthropists, but by the government. And so I just sort of wanted to welcome the work. And perhaps on the research side, just to hear a little bit about the intergenerationality and the response of adults and people in positions of power to addressing child rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Lots of very difficult questions, so I'll try my best to answer some of those. I think in terms of research, we're at a very important crossroads now, as I was saying, especially when it comes to the just transition. You know, it really does help the cause when policy, legislation and regulation, its trajectory is all going in one way, and that is green, clean. And we know that those policies will involve more and more children finding themselves in very, very challenging, complex situations. And so if we know our government is pushing for that type of policy and we don't have all the answers and more research is needed, I think now more than ever, that's the catalyst required to secure more funding. And I'm speaking from my own experience. I'm currently involved in a Home Office project, as I mentioned earlier, looking at modern slavery in the DRC, and that's not by chance. You know, this is happening because there is an acknowledgement from the powers that be that this problem is not going away. And if anything, our own policies are going to be driving more and more children into child labour. And so I think that's, as researchers, as practitioners, we need to look for those nooks where we can kind of hook in and tie into what's happening now. And that, I think, for me, is the angle that we take at the UN Global Compact Network UK, trying to just tie in current, you know, what's happening now, and the role of government in that, I think, is really, really helpful. I think just your last question around the adults, I can only speak from my experiences in the DRC. I don't think that there was no reluctancy or hesitation to acknowledge the voices of the children and what they were saying. You know, it was very rare where we came across adults and people in authority that didn't agree with the children's voices. The problem is, as my fellow panellists have already alluded to, enforcement is weak or non-existent. Legislation is there and there's nobody to enforce. They don't have the correct infrastructure to be able to carry out its national and international obligations. So it doesn't really matter what the adults think at the end of the day, because if the mechanisms aren't there, if the resources are not allocated, then to Danny's point, you know, we're not, you know, the children's voices are paramount, but they can only take them so far. And it's actually up to us as the adults to ensure their safety and well-being, and we can't do that if we find ourselves working in contexts where there is a lack of the rule of law, or it simply isn't there. So yeah, I think I'll pass it over to my fellow panelists.
Thank you. Adults. I think adults are often really supportive, but it's not always the adults that you think. Bangladesh is much more defensive at the moment in terms of why we just don't have a problem here. So they talk about it, and it can be very difficult. But you know, if we start to mobilise on the ground with senior professionals talking to others, then I think that opens up a different sort of space. On the research question, I mean, Vicky, I know you would agree with entirely, but I think one of the things that's interesting now is this sort of this connection between research and practice. That actually we use a model of action research, but there are other models which bring research in real time directly to implementation. The children are opening up something based on the research that they've done in the last 3 months. The adults are building a body of evidence that they act on, that they learn from. So there is something here that's really important about a new model, not totally new, we've been working on it for a long time, but I think at a policy level it's a new model, where we need to reimagine research in a much more sort of practice-oriented environment. It's hard to get funding for something that seems to be in the academy, sort of separated out there. It probably is easier if we can actually really see the connection between the research and the results that are happening on the ground.
So yes, what those two say, but also I'm going to be the bad guy. I don't want more research, I want action. I don't need more funding for this. What I need is a cultural shift. I need people in this country to understand that spending £5 on having your car hand validated, there is something going horribly wrong there. If you're going to get clothes for a couple of quid, how do you think, it's what Danny said, how do you think that that is able to be produced? What I want is us to change our concept of what is and isn't acceptable when we're buying things. And the best way that I've ever seen, and I know that I'm old, but Blue Peter and Pester Power over dolphins and tuna have a massive impact. We've got 650 MPs in this place. They will all have probably a dozen primary schools, secondary schools. The children that I met are incredibly persuasive. They're on social media, they've got internet, they could be directly talking to children in our constituencies and saying what's going on and saying what needs to change. And then the collaborative approach that both Bea and Danny were talking about. With a very few exceptions, I don't think that businesses are trying to exploit children. What they're trying to do, everybody, is keep their heads above water. So if we're able to offer them ways to do that in a more equitable way, that's what we should be doing. Not just having more consultations, more research, because we know what the problems are. Sorry, I wasn't being lead.
That's all right. I think we have had 3 hands up.
Research we do leads to action. It's action.
Yes,
Research.
I can we'll do this after.
I've seen 3 questions. We've got Ian and Ben, and I don't know your name, David. So maybe if we take all 3 and then the panelists can kind of respond to all 3, because I'm aware we're running a bit over time.
I'm sorry I'm a bit delayed.
We're grateful you're here and your contribution throughout as well.
Well, I just wanted to say that we've been doing a lot of work, and I sent an organisation within the Department of Australia, part of that as well, and also to the Centre for Social Justice. And the key thing about all of this seems to come down to understanding that companies need to make full declarations about their supply chains. They've got away with it for a long, long time because governments say it's too difficult to check all the supply chains, so the fact is that for the cheaper products it's not worth their time. There are, however, companies that can do this now. I think you were at the presentation, I think, that I had over a company called Oratane. Oratane uses the existing science to check products because they sample at the source. So they can tell you, and we did this because of China, because China's riddled with slave labour at the moment. Uyghur slave labour, Tibetan slave labour, etc. Using lots of things that we wear today, cotton shirts, because cotton, 40% of that is grown in the Uyghur area. So, but they've been sampling for the last 10 years in these areas. They can tell you now where a product wasn't just grown, where it was actually made, which factory floor it was made on. So they can spot for you exactly where that came from. So then, if you're able to tag that as a forced child labour or slave labour centre, the company that's not bothered to find out or declaring it, now governments can start dealing with it because they are meant to, anyway, on the Modern Slavery Act, declare that they are absent of slave labour or forced labour in any degree. So there are companies, there's no excuse now for governments. Governments should be using those companies to check, spot check supply chains and decide. And then the second part of that becomes the whole issue about automation. The truth is, this is a law of diminishing returns, because at some point this work will be taken somewhere else where the labour is cheaper. So countries like Bangladesh need to really massively invest now in the technology that allows them to compete against that, but now by using higher levels of automation, and with those higher levels of automation goes higher levels of training, salaries. It's the normal process. It happened here in the UK, happens endlessly. But that is never So often, if you don't mind me saying so, quite often we talk about the problems, etc. But the reality is twofold to solve this. One, know what's happening. B, embarrass the companies, proceed against the company. Secondly, therefore, say to countries like Bangladesh, you've really got to be investing in automation, otherwise this business is going to leave you. Sure as God made little green apples. The fashion industry moves like a bullet as soon as their margins disappear. You talk about the margins at the bottom end of that supply chain. Those come down, no profits on those, they move. They'll be in lots of parts of Africa next, which is what they're talking about. My daughter works in the fashion industry, she tells me endlessly they're getting accountants saying you've got to move, this is all becoming too expensive. So I think, if you don't mind me saying, we need to make the case much more. Well, government should know, no excuse. Supply chains should be prosecuted on the basis that this is now against the law. And that starts to wake people up, and then talk to Bangladesh at that stage, and companies like that will have to invest the money that they're making to sustain themselves in automation and thus greater levels of profit within that allows us to pay those people higher salaries and train them too. So,
Yeah. David, maybe that's even better.
I think I've been involved on child labour issues since 1991, quite a long time. Even then, people were saying, why don't we ask children what they want to do and why they want to do? And so this isn't new. So the problem sometimes, and hasn't come up, I don't think, this afternoon, is that children's ideas of what is possible are very limited. And you can't expect them to want more than they can see locally. Now, in the short term, that's absolutely practical and right, but it doesn't, in my opinion, change anything for the medium to the long term, and that's where the problem is.
Okay, Ben Sullivan from Railway Children. Just looking through the report, it's an excellent report and excellent presentation. There's not the words I've found that I disagree with. My question is what I didn't see in the report and what I haven't really heard you talking about, which is street-connected children. So I couldn't find any mention in the recommendations, even the discussion about the causes of child labour. There's no reference to street-connected children or the particular circumstances that they're in. So the question really is kind of, given that it's acknowledged that street-connected children work in the informal sector generally and generally in the domestic, serving the domestic market, aren't they going to be kind of the last to be affected by any part of recommendations? So how really would you see something benefiting them? So you mentioned in your introduction, you want to see investment in tackling the causes of child labour. I think from your introduction, I think we probably agree that street connectedness is part of is a very strong cause for child labour. So would you want to encourage the government to be putting resources behind addressing the issues of street connected children?
100%, but I'll give it to Pia for the full.
Maybe we'll just in terms of all three comments, maybe all the board response to all three comments, any final thoughts? Are you ready to play? I feel like our two children have especially recorded this for us, so it'd be nice to get them. And then I'll pick up on Ben's question.
So I think you mentioned Oraton, and I agree that there is no excuse for businesses to say that they don't know. The conversation has moved on since then. There is lots of technology. You gave one example in terms of the forensics involved with identifying provenance, but there are many other technologies available, geolocation, aerial spatial technology, which can situate where a mine is, for example, that is being run by rebels or not recognised by the government, for example. So there are lots of different ways now that business can engage with what's happening on the ground. So I just wanted to make that point. In terms of the children's ideas that you mentioned being limited, I think there's a really, really difficult balance when you're talking to children, full stop, about any of these really, really difficult adult problems that they are having to face, that they're facing in their day-to-day lives. it is a fine balance, as you said, between what they think is possible versus what is actually possible. The experience that we have is really trying to identify where their agency really lies. That's not always an easy task, and so we have to make sure that we work not only directly with the children, but those who are supporting them, to really be able to understand each and every individual child. And this is one of the problems that we faced on our very, very first trips, where you kind of clump all of these children into one box, and you categorise them as, okay, these are all street children, they're all facing the same problems. Absolutely incorrect assumption to make. Every single individual child will have different challenges, will go through different circumstances, whether that be financial, social, economical, etc. And so I think, for practitioners, researchers, when you're talking to children, we need to listen to each and every individual as they are an individual child, and rather than making those assumptions that just because they all find themselves in very, very similar situations, because that will inform their agency and how much they understand about the situation they find themselves in. And then lastly, in terms of the report, I'll leave Peter to answer that, but what I can say is an example of how we're working on the ground in the DRC is with the labour inspectorate, for example, so strengthening their capacity. I think one of my fellow panellists mentioned earlier that you have a huge, large geographic area and 1 or 2 labour inspectorates servicing that entire region. We found exactly the same problem. So if you do have children coming and reporting that their employment status or the working conditions, and you don't have people understanding how you take a report from somebody who is in a vulnerable position, that will obviously determine the course of action and what happens to that report. So we're really working at the ground level to try and tackle how reports are being made, what the next steps are, and keeping the child at the forefront of the inquiry from the start to the finish. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me say something about what I see as being 2 streams of work which are important. And I think they're different, and to understand that they're different is important. So one piece of work relates to global supply chains. And the issue there is that the children get displaced further and further down the supply chain, and the technologies are there, but actually they're very rarely implemented. There's all sorts of confounding factors, like parts of the product being brought to markets, or the need for a small business or a medium-sized business to deal with changes in market flow. So suddenly there's an increase in demand, they go straight to the informal sector. Someone visits their factories, there's no children there, but they've brought in materials from somewhere else. That's happening time and time again. So there is an issue about the formal sector, the global supply chains, and what's happening at the bottom levels of the supply chains. But there is a separate issue, which is about domestic markets and supply chains in the informal sector, which are barely even looked at, which are barely touched, and where none of this technology is even close. And they require different solutions, probably. So we probably need to think about both of them. The other thing I wanted to highlight, with the example I just gave about, say, for example, sudden increases in demand, the relationship between the informal sector and the formal sector is quite complicated, and we're beginning to see how closely connected they are, but in very invisible ways. Learning more about that is actually going to be really important. And the point about automation is an interesting one. One of our groups, one of our small business groups, is in the leather sector, has come to the same conclusion. The only way we're going to deal with this is to form a cooperative and to start to get automated. But it's not the higher level of automation that the medium and the bigger sized businesses are engaging in. And one of the problems that's happened in Dhaka is that they've moved the whole of the old leather sector to a place called Kamarapur, and it's created a whole set of new problems. So they've got all of the stuff over there, but they haven't sorted out the water, there's a waste problem, there's a whole new informal sector growing around the formal sector. So it's automated, but it's created another set of unintended consequences. So thinking about automation at the level which is appropriate for some of these small businesses is going to be critical. We're on the next
We're on
one.
the next one.
Okay, fine. I won't mention the last one then, but I would just say, in my experience, don't underestimate your children's vision. And actually, they do have a pretty good idea. And with mobile phones these days, they know what the other kids are doing. They can see what education is out there. They can see what careers are out there. They can see what the other kids are doing. They have a vision. The question is that they need to get out of where they're stuck. And that's about the family violence. It's about poverty. It's about pathways into different careers that are actually realistic for them.
The time, yes, wasn't the focus of this inquiry, but it underpins all the work that this group does.
Just say that. I think what we'll do is we'll play the children while people who need to peel off for a drink can, but we'll put them on now. And maybe just to say thank you all so much for coming this afternoon. It's been a really good discussion. I'll pick up with you, Ben. We've definitely taken stuff from the world of street connected children, which informed what we're doing, and it moves back into it. But thank you all for joining, and enjoy the kids and have a drink over there when you can get to it.